Hey guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be creating 10 cards using the Seahorse background stamp by Simon Says Stamp. And I'm also going to be using some of the elements from the Beautiful Mermaid stamp set just because the sentiments go great with this background stamp. So for my first card, I'm going to be using my Misty here. I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm just adding some Tombow Mono multi-glue to the back of my card panel, smearing that around with my finger and waiting until it's dry. Once it's dry, it's repositionable because I have a feeling I'm probably going to have to stamp multiple times. Going to position that into my Misty there, treat that with my anti-static tool, and then I'm going to go ahead and ink up the stamp with the clear embossing ink by Simon Says Stamp, which is very similar to the Versamark. I find it to be a little less sticky though, so it's a little bit easier to work with. I did, like I said, stamp this multiple times. I think I stamped this one twice, just because you can't really see if you got a good impression. So I wanted to make sure that I did before adding my embossing powder. So because I'm using white cardstock here, I am going to be using clear embossing powder. You can either use clear or white for this. It doesn't really matter. You can see I kind of creased my paper when I was pulling that up from my Misty, probably because my glue was not completely dry before I positioned that in there. So I am using a detailed embossing powder because this particular background stamp is very detailed. You want to make sure that you're using a finer embossing powder no matter what color you're using. Making sure my heat gun is completely heated up before bringing that to the paper to minimize the amount of warping that I'll get from that heat. You can see that that little crease there is kind of working itself out with the heat. So like I said, not really too concerned about it. So for this card, we're going to keep it nice and simple. We're just doing some emboss resist. So once the embossing powder was completely melted and you want to let it cool off for just a couple of seconds, I'm going to bring in some antique linen distress oxide ink and a blending brush. I'm only using one particular color on this card. You can definitely use multiple colors, which we will do in a few cards from now, but I'm just kind of blending that on there, going right over those embossed areas. Once I was happy with the coverage, I'm going to go ahead and take a dry paper towel and I'm just going to rub directly over that card panel to pick up any of that ink that's kind of laying on top of those embossed images. You can see that kind of brightens everything up. So once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and cut this down with a stitched rectangle die. This is also by Simon, and this is the largest rectangle die that is in the set. And I am going to go ahead and adhere this down to my white A2 size top folding note card, again using my Tombow Mono multi glue. If you've watched my videos before, you'll know that I prefer to use the wet glue just because it gives me a couple of seconds to kind of reposition things if needed. Going to take another piece of the Nina Solar White and treating that with my anti-static tool. Going to be using two of the sentiments in the Beautiful Mermaids stamp set, stamping that out with that antique linen distress oxide ink, and then sprinkling on some of that clear embossing powder directly over it. Now you can definitely emboss with the distress oxides, but I do find that they dry a little bit quicker than the regular distress inks. So you don't want to let it sit too long before sprinkling on that embossing powder. Once again, making sure that my heat gun is heated up before bringing that to the paper. And then I will trim these down into skinny little strips for my little sentiments there that'll go directly in the center of my card panel. Going to go ahead and pop those up with some Scotch foam tape, and that is it. No, actually, that is not it. First, I added a little bit of shimmer to every single one of these seahorses with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen, just to add a little bit of sparkle. And that is it for card number one. Card number two, we are going to do a little bit more embossing. This time we're going to be doing some watercolor. So I have a piece of Canson watercolor paper here. Again, using that Tombow Mono multi glue to kind of smear that on the back of the panel, letting that dry. I kind of stick my fingers to it just to make sure it's not too sticky, but it's sticky enough. Treating that with my anti-static tool. And this time I think I had to stamp this 3 times because this is watercolor paper. It is textured. So not only are we using a background stamp, we can't see where we're stamping, but we have textured paper. So you want to make sure that you stamp that multiple times to make sure that you get a great impression. Switching over to some white embossing powder because the paper is not completely white. So I felt more comfortable using the white rather than the clear. Again, making sure that heat gun is completely heated up before bringing that to the paper, melting that embossing powder and letting that cool for just a second or two. I'm going to stick this down to my board with some washi tape. I just use an old clipboard. You can see that I've used it many times. And I'm going to be using Cracked Pistachio, Mermaid Lagoon, and Peacock Feathers Distress Oxides. Going to just smush those onto my Ranger craft mat here, and then take a paintbrush and I'm going to cover up the entire panel here with just clean water. Then I'm going to bring in some of that pigment and just drop it in there and just kind of letting it spread. Now it will not spread as much as it normally would because you have those embossed areas. So you kind of have to work it a little bit. With the Cracked Pistachio, I pretty much covered the entire panel, and for the other two, I kind of just dropped the color in there and let it do its thing. I let this air dry. You can heat set it. Just keep in mind that being we embossed it, you're going to reactivate that embossing powder and it won't be as raised up. Once it was dry, I spattered on some clean water as well as some shimmer spray with just the nozzle and then dabbed that up with a paper towel. Once my panel was completely dry, I removed the washi tape and you will have a little bit of a border left over. So I like to trim this off. So I trimmed off just a little bit from all four sides. This panel was initially cut a little bit larger than an A2 size anyway. So I got rid of those little white borders from that washi tape. Going to add my heat embossed sentiment here. So I have a scrap piece of black cardstock, treated that with my anti-static tool, stamped my sentiment from the beautiful mermaid stamp set, sprinkled on some white embossing powder and heat set that with my preheated heat gun. I'll go ahead and trim this down a little bit with my tonic trimmer here. And in order to make my panel really pop, I prefer to layer it onto a piece of black cardstock that is just slightly larger than my card panel, but a little bit smaller than the card base itself. So that way you have a little bit of an outline with the black and the white. I like the look of it. It just makes it pop a little bit more. So I'm going to use my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere that down to the black panel and then use that same glue to adhere this down to a top folding white A2 size note card. And you can see that panel really pops. And especially having the black, white heat embossed sentiment on the black cardstock, it really makes it pop. Going to pop this up with some foam tape and right in the center of the card panel there. And that is the second card. So for the third card, we're kind of going to do a little bit something similar. We're at least going to use the same colors. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss this. I'm not going to keep showing you the same thing over and over, but this is a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock. So you can use Nina for this, but I prefer the Bristol Smooth because we are going to be using just a little bit of water. So again, treating that with my anti-static tool, stamping this out twice with my embossing ink, and then I'm going to be using the white embossing powder once again, making sure that that heat gun is completely heated up. You want to avoid as much warping as you possibly can. Being we're covering up the entire panel with embossing powder, it's pretty easy for that paper to warp. So once that was heat set, we're going to use those same colors of the Distress Oxides that we did for the watercolor panel, only this time we're going to be doing just regular ink blending. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with my Cracked Pistachio towards the bottom corner, I guess, and then blending that out with the Peacock Feathers and then finishing off with the Mermaid Lagoon. You'll see that the first time around as I'm working my way up here, I'm not really necessarily worried about getting the perfect blend. I'm kind of just mapping out my colors at this point. Once I reach the top, I'll go back down in the opposite direction to make sure that my colors are blended. Sometimes I may tap the blending brush a little bit onto the ink pad to pick up a little bit more ink, and other times I'm just kind of going with whatever's left over on the brush just to make sure that the colors are blended, but not necessarily adding any more ink to the paper. Once I was happy with the coverage and happy with the results, we're going to go ahead and pick up a tiny paintbrush here for this image, and I'm just picking up some clean water and basically painting in these little seahorses. I let the water sit there just for a couple of seconds and then dab that up with a paper towel. You don't want to rub the paper towel against the card panel, or else you're just going to kind of move that water and you're going to pick up the ink in places that you don't necessarily want that to be picked up. So I'm just dabbing up and down with that paper towel. Now I ended up doing every other row of these little seahorses. You can do all of them if you want, but I figured it would just add a little bit more to the pattern by leaving some the way they are and then going every other row, I guess you could say. So once all of that was done, we are going to go ahead and assemble the card, very similar to the one we assembled previously. And I'm going to use a piece of black cardstock, again, cut slightly larger than my card panel itself. I am going to let me say that again. I'm going to white heat emboss the sentiment on another piece of black cardstock to pop that up, but it's pretty much set up very similar to the watercolor card that we did previously. So that is card number 3. Moving on to card number 4, we're going to be doing some tone-on-tone stamping. This is super easy, and I always love the results that you get from this. So I'm going to bring out a piece of dull pink cardstock, and this is also by Simon Says Stamp. Again, I put some Tombow Mono multi glue on the back of it, let that dry, position that into my MISTI, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my background stamp with that dull pink ink, which closely matches the cardstock. So you'll get a tone-on-tone look here. Next, I'm going to go ahead and trim down my card panel just a little bit. I'm taking 1/4 of an inch off of the top or the bottom, whatever side you choose, as well as the side, and then taking a piece of white cardstock and making that just a little bit larger than my card panel and a little bit smaller than the card base itself. So basically doing the same thing as we did with the black cardstock, only doing this with white. I am using my card base also as that dull pink cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. And I didn't want to put a sentiment strip on this one because I felt like I'm still doing the same thing over and over. So I decided to heat emboss the sentiment directly onto the card panel itself. So I tested the area out to make sure that that ink was dry before adding my embossing powder. I didn't want to run the risk of having that stick to places I didn't want it to stick to. Stamped out the sentiment from that beautiful mermaid stamp set, sprinkled on some white embossing powder and heat set that, making sure that the heat gun is completely heated up because I didn't want to reactivate or melt that adhesive that I've already used. Going to go ahead and finish off the card with some clear Nouveau drops. These are Mountain Dew, wow, a Morning Dew Nouveau drops, and that is it for that one. Next, we are going to go ahead and stamp the background stamp onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I am using Blackout ink by Ink on 3 for this because it is a Copic safe ink. I'm going to be doing just a little bit of very, very simple coloring for this one. I did go ahead and stamp this twice. Even though I got a pretty good impression, I noticed that some of my little seahorses there weren't the best. So I did end up stamping this twice. I will leave in just a little bit of the coloring just so that you can see the color combinations that I used. Sticking to a rainbow theme here, and I'm only using 2 colors on each one of my little seahorses because they are so teeny tiny, and I didn't want to have to fix too many coloring errors, even though I anticipated making some, but I didn't want to have any bleeding. So I'm going to go right in with the darkest color first to just make the right-hand side a little bit darker than the left. And then I'll go in with the lightest color to blend that out just a little bit. And I kind of kept with the same order as far as the colors go. I did not put the yellow and orange together next to each other like they are in a rainbow just because they were a little bit too similar. So I did spread those out a little bit. So once all of my coloring was done, I'm going to go ahead and die cut this panel, again using that largest stitched rectangle die. You can tell that I like to use the same supplies over and over. Backed that with a piece of black cardstock that is cut just a little bit larger than that panel itself. I did have some adhesive obviously on the back of my card panel there that I colored, so sometimes it may be a little bit hard to line up because it's sticky. So I did have to trim a little bit off the side that I was kind of just a little crooked there. So went ahead and adhered this down to my white A2 size note card. And once again, I am adding a sentiment strip. Not going to show you this again, but I am popping this up with some Scotch foam tape right there, pretty much in the same spot as I get every time. And that is it for the Copic colored background. So moving on to the next card, we're going to be doing a little bit of masking. So I have my background stamp here, and I'm not using my MISTI this time. So this is another way that you can use a background stamp. Taking some Post-it note tape, and I am just masking out a portion of the background stamp. Treating my cardstock, which is the Nina Solar White, with my anti-static tool, and I'm going to go ahead and ink up just the area inside those little masks there with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Making sure that you remove that masking paper first, or whatever you're using to mask. I'm going to place my card panel there flat down, and then take a scrap piece of paper over the top and just kind of rub my hands on that to make sure that my card panel is not moving, but making sure that I get a good impression, and I'm applying even pressure throughout. So you can see I have just a little strip there of my little seahorses. Going to use some clear embossing powder here, and once again making sure that heat gun is heated up before bringing that to the paper and melting that embossing powder. And you can see that you get a really crisp black image for each of these. I'm going to take some more of that Post-it note tape to mask out either side of my little strip of seahorses here before I go in and do my ink blending. I have my antique linen sitting on my desk still from that previous card, so I'm going to use that again, only using one color. And I wanted to concentrate the darkest area being in the center and kind of having that fade to a lighter color on either end, but it didn't do a great job with that. It kind of looks a little blobby in the middle, but it is what it is. So once I was happy with the coverage of my Distress Oxide inks, I'm going to go ahead and remove my Post-it note tape, and I didn't like it. I needed to kind of frame it in a little bit. So I decided to take my T-square ruler, and I'm using a black pen here. This is a EK Success journaling pen, but you can really use any black pen here. And I'm going to create 2 lines on either side of my little strip of seahorses here. You can do 1, you can do 3, you can do however many you want. I just like the look of the 2 just because I feel like it frames it in nicely. So once that was done, I'm going to go ahead and adhere this down to my A2 size note card. This is the same size, so there's not going to be any border here. And again, creating a white embossed sentiment on a piece of black cardstock. And this time I'm going to put this in the lower left-hand corner. Popping that up with some Scotch foam tape once again, and finishing off the card with some Morning Dew Nouveau drops, just a few around the sentiment itself. So that is the masking of a background stamp. Next, we're going to move on to another card. Well, we're going to move on to 2 cards here. We're going to create 2 cards at once. So starting off with the background here, again, we're going to heat emboss this, but I'm not using my MISTI. I'm going to do the same thing as I did for the previous card, stamping or inking the background stamp with that embossing ink. Treated my card stock or my card panel there with my anti-static tool, placing this flat down and using a scrap piece of paper to make sure that this has a nice crisp image, and making sure that my embossing powder is going to stick. I did have some issues, but I'll show you how I fixed that in a minute. So once again, going to sprinkle on that white embossing powder and heat set that, and we'll move on to the ink blending itself. This time I'm going to be using abandoned coral, carved pumpkin, picked raspberry, and seedless preserves. And I don't want to, for this one, I guess I don't want to have one color just be in one corner, because we're going to end up cutting our card panel down. So I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, it will in a minute. So I'm going to go horizontally. I'm starting off with the seedless preserve, then adding the picked raspberry, then the abandoned coral, then the carved pumpkin, and back to the picked raspberry and seedless preserves, because I didn't want to put that orange next to the purplish color. It wouldn't go well. So again, just working my way up from one side of the card panel to the other, just laying out my color, and then I am going to move back in the opposite direction, sometimes adding more ink, sometimes I'm not, just making sure that I get a really good blend with each of these colors. These colors really blend well together, and I really like the vibrant look it gives. So once that was done, I'm going to fix up this one Seahorse here that I didn't get a great impression with when I heat embossed it. I'm going to use my white gel pen. Now, it's not going to be perfect because I can't draw this detailed Seahorse with a white gel pen, but I am going to kind of go over the lines so it's not quite as noticeable and it kind of blends in with the rest of them. I cut down, or I die cut this panel with that largest stitch rectangle die once again, and then I am going to cut my panel at a diagonal. I also cut 2 pieces of Nina Solar White with that same stitch rectangle die. For my ink blended panel, I'm going to line up the corners of the card panel diagonally and go right down with my tonic trimmer. These are going to fit nicely, being we use the same die, these are going to fit nicely with these card panels here. I have pre-colored some of these mermaids, or at least 2 of these mermaids from the Beautiful Mermaid stamp set, and I'm going to go ahead and assemble my cards. I'm gluing down this triangle here with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. You may have to add a little bit more pressure just because you may have some warping due to the heat and all the moisture that we added from the Distress Oxides. Gonna bring out, what did I use? I used Coral Reef dye ink by Simon Says Stamp for my sentiments, and both of these sentiments also came from the same stamp set, the Beautiful Mermaids. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp that out first, and then I will position my mermaid. These mermaids are quite large, so I want to make sure that I'm leaving myself enough room for the sentiment. Stamp that out, and then I will pop her up with my Scotch foam tape. Same thing for the other card here. Going to stamp my sentiment first, and then I will arrange my mermaid. Didn't have the cleanest stamp when I went to stamp this, and you can see that it was stained, but I thought it was at least clean. So I didn't get a true orangish color when I stamped it, but it is what it is. Went ahead and popped up my mermaid again with foam tape, and then I will adhere both of these panels down to a white A2 size note card, just leaving a small white border on both of these. Finishing off these cards with some Nuvo Dream Drops, and I'm using the Cloud 9, which is white but iridescent at the same time. Also added a little bit of sparkle to their tails or fins, I guess, or maybe they're both. I don't know. Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen I used for that. And like I said, just added a few Dream Drops. I do squirt this out onto a scrap piece of paper to make sure there's no air bubbles before bringing that to my card. So those are 2 cards, same technique. Moving on to the next card, again, we're going to be using the same colors of Distress inks for these. I already heat embossed this because you guys know the drill by now. You've seen me do it several times. Going to do some more ink blending, but this time I'm going to be adding a little bit more. So I'm not going to add the same color multiple times. I'm using each 4 of these colors only once, if that makes sense. So going pretty much in the same order, making sure that I get a good blend the second time around. Once I was happy with that, I did rub this with a white paper towel to kind of clean off any of that ink that may be sitting on the embossing. I trimmed this panel down to 1-inch strips. So I should have said this before, but this panel that we ink blended was 5 1/4 by 4. So my plan was to lay these down in kind of like a tiling technique with foam tape across my panel. I realized that I didn't really leave myself enough space if I used all 4 strips. So I decided to just toss one or put one aside for maybe another project, and only used 3. So I'm using my grid mat there to kind of line up and to guide me as far as where the center of the card panel is. I lay down the center one first, and then I'll lay down the 2 on either side. This kind of helps guide me a little bit more as to the positioning, but do whatever works for you. So once I had those down, I'm going to adhere this down to a white A2 size note card. And for the sentiment, I have already stamped, embossed, the sentiment strip onto a piece of black cardstock. No surprise there. And I want this to kind of lay across my little tiles there. But some of these areas are raised and some of them are not. So I'm going to cut little teeny tiny pieces of that same foam tape. You want to make sure that you're using the same foam tape or same fun foam, whatever you choose to use, so that it's the same height. I'm going to fit these little pieces in between my little tiles and on either edge of my card panel there, and remove the backing tape and add just a little bit of the liquid glue or the Tombow Mono Multi Glue onto my little tiles that are raised up. Now, this is the first time I'm using this foam tape. I do like it, but it is sticky. So it's kind of hard sometimes to remove the backing, but I do like it so far. So I laid my sentiment strip across there, and I'm just going to take my scissors and snip off any excess there. And that is it for that card. Moving on to the next card here, I'm going to take my VersaFine Onyx Black ink again, and I am going to take a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock once again, laying this flat down onto my background stamp, using that scrap piece of paper to make sure that I get a really good impression. I'm not going to do any embossing this time, but I do want to use a waterproof ink. I could have used the blackout ink, but this is what was in front of me. So I'm taking some Zig Clean Color Real Brush pens here, and I'm just scribbling it. I'm not really concentrating on any specific area. I used 2 blues and a little bit of a purple. And once I had the color down, I'm going to take a spritzer bottle and just spritz it. And I'm just letting the colors move the way they want to move. I went ahead and let this air dry just because I did want to avoid warping, and I ran it through my scan and cut. So this would probably only work for an image or for a stamp like this if you have a scan and cut, unless you want to fussy cut all of these, which I didn't. So I went ahead and put those aside. We are going to be making a shaker card. I have a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, cut down with that stitched rectangle die. I am stamping out one of the mermaids from the Beautiful Mermaid stamp set with Blackout ink by Ink on 3. I did keep the coloring in here because I know you guys sometimes like to see the color combinations that I use, but I have this sped up because, as you can see, this video is long enough. So I'm starting off with the skin tones, concentrating my shading being underneath where her hair is, hanging over her face and over the rest of her body too. So that would also cast a shadow there. For her hair, I usually like coloring hair to see what kind of texture I can get. But I remember using this set when it came in a kit not too long ago, and I struggled with the hair then, and I'm struggling with the hair now. But being this is going to be a shaker card, this isn't going to be too noticeable. So whenever you're doing the coloring, especially for a shaker card, or if it's the coloring maybe that you're not too happy with, make it into a shaker card, because honestly, it's not going to be all that noticeable once everything is put together. But like always, I started off with my darkest color. I kind of added shading and highlights wherever I felt like it, because I don't know what is what when it comes to the hair of these mermaids. I just did whatever. For the mermaid's tail or fin or both, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to be using some yellow greens, and I'm going to be using the G07. Yes, G07 as my darkest color just for that shading. There's going to be a shadow where her hair is hanging over her fin or tail, and then I'm just keeping the highlight off to the right-hand side. For the little seashell in her hair, as well as her little bathing suit top or seashell top, whatever it is, going to use some purples to bring out the colors in those seahorses, and then bring in the E15, the Y26 and 23 for the other shell that she's holding, as well as this little starfish. I did miss this little part of her hair. I don't know how I missed it, but like I said, this hair confuses the heck out of me. So I went back and fixed that. Next, we're going to go ahead and die cut the shaker frame. I'm using the largest stitch rectangle die and the next size down, sticking this down with some Post-it note tape so it doesn't shift around when I run it through my Gemini. And I'm just using my wet glue here to adhere my acetate to that little frame there. I prefer to use the wet glue because I never line things up correctly the first time, as you can see. But you can certainly use a very strong double-sided adhesive if you choose. Going to use the foam tape. I cut these down into skinny little strips, went around the entire frame, and realized I needed a little bit more dimension so that all of my shaker pieces can shake around freely. So I removed the backing tape, and then I added another layer directly over that first layer of that scotch. It's not scotch, the regular foam tape. I'll have to link it below because I can't even remember the name of the brand. So I'm adding my shaker pieces here. I'm adding all of my little seahorses face down because they will not twist and turn around once they're in that shaker. And I'm just going to add some sequins. And these are a mix of everything. I don't know what brand they are. They're just kind of in my stash. And I just took a bunch of blues and I'm adding those to the center of my shaker frame here. Next, when you remove the backing of a shaker that is already full, you want to make sure that you're kind of holding it in the center. So you can see I have my finger pressed right in the center of the acetate. If you don't, that backing sometimes gets a little stuck and your sequins will go flying across your craft room, and you'll probably be finding them and picking them up probably for the rest of your life. So you just want to be careful with that. Lining up my colored image here, and you can see, again, didn't line that up great, but because nobody's going to see this part, I was able to stick my scissors in there and cut off any excess that's kind of showing through, and nobody will know the difference. I went ahead and adhered this flat down to my white A2 size note card with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue once again. And for my sentiment on this one, I'm taking a scrap piece of bluish purplish cardstock that I have in my scrap bin, stamping that with some dye black ink by Simon Says Stamp. No embossing for this one. Cut that down into a strip and then finally adhered that down with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue right there in the center. So that is it. That is the 10th card. Here is a very quick look at all 10 cards that we created today with one background stamp. So I'm hoping you were able to get some inspiration. I will go ahead and list all of the supplies that I used in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.